Good evening, everybody in the UK, and a good afternoon to North America. I'm going to present tonight some work that I've been doing for my PhD dissertation at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, New Brunswick. The tramway companies in the Canadian Corps during the First World War. Just a second, she doesn't want to. There we go. The tramway companies in the Canadian Corps during the First World War are largely misunderstood organization and function because of a focus by Canadian historians on infantry combat and the casualties, along with the relationship between Canada and the United Kingdom. Canadian historians also focus on the superior achievements the Canadian Corps achieved in comparison to other British Corps. Because the tramway had a dual construction and logistics operating function, they often get relegated and treated somewhat as an oddity. But I will argue that General Arthur Currie, the general officer commanding of the Canadian Corps, and his chief engineer, Brigadier General Bethune-Lindsay, and Brigadier General Jasper Farmer, the deputy adjutant and quartermaster general, fully understood the tactical benefits and the enhancements that tramways could bring to the operational level of warfare if the Corps had its own organic light railway capability. Thus, these three and a few influential senior British officers recognized that light railways complemented Canada having its own national army. This presentation explores the long road to a permanent and efficient tramway capability as part of Canada's First World War national army. The Canadian Corps, the Canadian Expeditionary Force and Canadian Corps were latecomers to the construction and the operation of railways on the Western Front. GHQ of the British Expeditionary Force had found it useful to use light railways in 1915-16 to reduce the wear and tear on roads, particularly during rainy periods and thaw conditions in December and February. There is a myth, though, that the Canadians were the first to organize a unit to construct and operate forward lines. In fact, the Canadian engineers first recorded working on tramways much later in August 1915 when they built a monorail at Plug Street in the Ypres sector. These early 1915 tramways tended to be ad hoc affairs and were not centrally directed. Beginning in October 1915 and continuing into the spring of 1916, Canadian field engineer companies provided parties for constructing and later maintaining a 60-centimeter line at Dranutra and Vlamertinghe. Important to the discussion of the utility of tramways are some familiar faces that you see on the screen. General Sir Arthur Currie, and some not so familiar faces are his Corps staff, General Lindsay, Farmer, and Hughes, and some key tramway unit actors are seen here in this composite image. Majors Goldie, Rogers, and Winslow, and some of their captains. And last is General Stewart, the only Canadian general at GHQ who had to navigate British strategic priorities and the Canadian Corps' desire for autonomy. There is also a general whom I call the patron saint of the tramways, and that's General Horn, GOC of the First Army. Without a dedicated tramway construction units in the Canadian Corps from 1915 to 1916, the Canadian Corps believed tramway construction was actually a distraction to both the field engineers, who were primarily a brigade asset, and the pioneers, who were a divisional asset for building, maintaining, and operating light railways. The Canadian Corps also found that the centralization of construction requests, traffic control, and movement requests at the Army level stifling for rapid tactical needs, either to augment motor and horse transport, or when needed to move batteries and provide ammunition. The Canadian Corps solution was to create an ad hoc temporary composite pioneer company on May 19, 1916, to do the Corps level transportation tasks for the chief engineer of the Canadian Corps. The British allowed such an organization because of a shortage of troops to man light railways. The unit formed west of Ypres, and the first OC was Major Roger Percy Rogers from the 1st Tunneling Company. The company had 7 officers and 225 other ranks on attachment from their parent units. Rogers was a hard rock mining civil engineer from Northern Ontario for a company that had a narrow gauge railway. The Composite Pioneer Company reported to Major Edward Crosby Goldie, a pre-war civil engineer and contractor, as the field engineer Tramways. The company obtained its first 2 locomotives by salvaging them from the Dickiebush Lake. The Composite Company operated 12 miles in the Popering Cruise Strat in just west of Ypres. To support the Somme campaign in 1916, on September 6th, the Composite Company took over construction of a light railway line from Albert to past Poitiers Cemetery. They also completed branch lines to the windmill on the Poitiers-Beaume Road and connected with the line from Auvelay at Poitiers Cemetery. They used mule and horsepower in the circled areas because the line was unballasted with stone. The Somme was the first time they used railway to evacuate casualties. When the Canadian Corps moved to the Vimy sector in late October 1916, the Composite Company came also. It was here the company was split into 2. Lieutenant Samuel Fraser Workman, formerly of the 38th Infantry Battalion and the 3rd Pioneers, and a pre-war railway engineer, and 29 men proceeded to Bois de Bray in the south to form the Canadian Corps Light Railway Company. This is sometimes called Number 1 Section, Canadian Corps Tramway Company. Captain Reginald Leonard Horatio Gooday, a pre-war engineer and surveyor of the 3rd Canadian Pioneer Battalion, took over command and brought with him 200 other ranks from the 3rd Pioneers. Number 2 Section was formerly the Composite Pioneer Company and was still under Major Rogers at GUI. The core tram line at Vimy was divided into 2 sectors, as you see here, north and south. Both systems were under German observation and could only be operated to a limited extent in the daytime. In the northern sector, trains assembled at GUI. The wagons were taken over from the Army Light Railway system at Carency, hauled by petrol tractor to Souchez Wood, and from there moved forward to points in the Zouave Valley west of Vimy Ridge by mules. In the southern sector, trains assembled in marshalling yards up the Bois de Bray and were hauled by petrol tractor and by over 300 mules to various stations. The average tonnage hauled in the northern sector was 1,000 tons per day, and in the southern sector, 275. General Lindsay, the chief engineer, thought, quote, "This could be considerably augmented if more petrol tractors can be supplied. Mule haulage should be done away with as it's not economical," quote. During the build-up to the Vimy Ridge in March 1917, the Tramway Company had to deal with over 60 breaks in the line that month due to shell fire. They also noted they could haul 4 times as much in February because they had 4 more tractors, now making 6 in the southern sector. The Canadians and the British won the battle for Vimy Ridge on April 9th to 12th and immediately began tramway extensions. From April 14th to the 30th, there was 600 to 1,400 men a day engaged on extending the tram line through the trench sector and down the east side of the ridge. General Lindsay wrote after the battle, "The whole scheme of development of the system of tram lines in the past 5 months since the Corps moved into the area has been arranged with a view for providing for operations of this character. Their special work, however, done in preparation included the laying of 5,000 yards of track, making a total of 20 miles of line in operation under Corps control. 15 sidings were built to gun positions and dressing stations. 5,000 yards of track were collected to permit the beginning of immediate extension in the afternoon of 0 day," end quote. Sorry, back up. Major R.E. Twinney, the Deputy Assistant and Quartermaster General, 1st Army, thought, quote, "The Canadian Corps tram line from Territorial Siding to Commandant's House in the south is an interesting case as showing what can be done over a single line roughly laid with little ballast and worked by petrol tractors only. The deliveries were to batteries along the line," end quote. And the lead up to Hill 70 in August 1917 saw extensive conversations in July 1917 between the Canadian Corps of Currie, Lindsay, Farmer, Goldie, and Rogers, and the 1st Army and GHQ to figure out how the Canadian Corps would operate within GHQ's concept of light railways. The Directorate of Light Railways at GHQ and the Canadian Corps disagreed on some key philosophic ideas as to who should control the direction of construction and the assignment and priority of traffic. They also had a definitional misunderstanding. When GHQ spoke of light railways, they meant everything between the broad gauge railhead and the power head on the 60-centimeter line where the motive power switched to man and horse. Their definition included both sections of track that used steam and petrol-powered locomotives, which fell under GHQ for construction control and Army control for traffic assignment. In contrast, the Canadian Corps used a different definition of light railways for the portions of the line powered by steam. This portion of the line largely ran on a scheduled system that could operate day and night since the steam locomotives were kept from German view and artillery range. The petrol portion of the line, the Canadians viewed as tramways, and this is the term they used to differentiate from the steam portion. Trench tramways were another term for the pushcart portion of the network without mechanical power. The petrol and pushcar were a portion of the Canadian Corps were interested in controlling for both construction and traffic because the petrol locomotives served the medium artillery, which was under Corps control, and served the dumps feeding ammunition to the field artillery under divisional control. Generals Currie, Lindsay, and Farmer believed that the coordination effort with GHQ for new construction was too cumbersome and slow. Canadians thought over-centralization would greatly hinder the tactical mobility of the artillery and its need for gun spurs. Secondly, Canadians thought traffic should not be too centralized, otherwise there would be no capacity for rapidly moving guns or ammunition to new locations. GHQ, First Army, and the Canadian Corps argued back and forth through the summer of 1917. Getting tired of the debate and facing a shortage of lorries for the Hill 70 campaign, Currie reorganized the Composite Pioneer Company and the Canadian Corps Tramway Company into a single company known as the Canadian Corps Tramway Company on the 1st of August, still under Major Rogers. When the Canadian Corps moved slightly north from Vimy to Lens in July 1917 in preparation for the attack on Hill 70, they took over British tramway lines. The lines were so extensive that only gun spurs needed building. The light railway network was so dense here in part because of the pre-war industrialization of the Lens area. Complicating the Canadian Corps transportation plans was the GHQ planned maintenance program in July-August that reduced lorry availability by 50%. Also, petrol shortages caused by German U-boat attacks also hampered lorry operations. The Corps was told to use light railway and horse transport exclusively in lieu of lorries whenever possible. This direction from GHQ and Army seemed to reinforce Currie's belief that petrol-powered locomotives should fall under Corps control to give the Corps the flexibility to switch between railway, lorries, and horse transport as needed. Light railways helped alleviate traffic on roads and road surface breakdown, reduce the repair needs of the lorries, and reduce fuel consumption. This was the one of only 2 times the Canadian Corps became predominantly dependent on its light railway capability, the other being September-October of 1918. The tramway organization was so successful at Hill 70 that it reinforced Currie, Lindsay, and Farmer's beliefs that they had the more correct, or as phrased by Frederick Winslow Taylor of scientific management fame, the one best way, a phrase that engineers would have been familiar with at the time. Therefore, they formally put together a plan and arguments for an organic and permanent light railway capability for the Canadian Corps. Sorry, we got some math here. Central to their argument was the efficiency of tramways. General Currie wrote on the 15th of August, 1917, the first day of the Battle of Hill 70, quote, that the value of such a development from the standpoint of economy, saving of men and horses cannot be gainsaid, is evident by the fact that one day's traffic over Corps Tramway saved 2,640 men in red, 3,074 horses, 26 general service delivery wagons, 495 general service wagons, and 291 lorries. Lindsay prepared for Currie a submission to GHQ that indicated this table. We can conclude that in manpower, tramways are 36 times more efficient than the organic lorry and horse transport. From a load perspective, tramways are 3.7 times more efficient. And from a horsepower perspective, the tramways were 33 times more efficient. They only needed 400 horsepower in the tramway locomotives versus the 13,446 horsepower found in the lorries and the horses. Curry went on to say, quote, "I have no confidence that if these personnel are placed under the Light Railway Directorate, it will achieve the same results, and I'm not sure it will fulfill the same purpose." Quote, end quote. A day earlier, in a draft in a marginal note, Curry was far more acerbic, writing, quote, "The whole situation appears to be that the Directorate of Light Railways is determined to put a very efficient out of business in one way or another, solely because it is not directly under its control. The question of efficiency does not appear to enter the equation. The arguments advanced in favor of personnel being placed under the Directorate of Light Railways are supported by a thinly veiled threat that if I do not concur, the organization will be broken up. It is submitted that instead of destroying an organization, the efficiency of which has been proved, an endeavor should be made to provide each corps in the BEF with a similar organization." End quote. As mentioned, General Horne should be considered the patron saint of the Canadian Tramways because of his written support. On the 1st of September 1917, he supported the Canadians' plan for a permanent light railway capability by writing to GHQ, quote, "The men employed are highly skilled and have for many months now been doing the most valuable work in the forward area. Their work was of particular value during the period immediately following the Vimy operation, and in subsequent fighting, the Canadian Corps lines have followed troops closely in every fresh advance. In enterprise, experience, and rapidity of construction, as also in operation, this body of men is probably the most highly skilled and useful body of men's railway workers on the British Army front, and they have developed a fine esprit de corps." End quote. General Horne also wrote in a separate letter, quote, "The Canadian Corps view to the extent that every effort is being made that this corps is a self-supporting formation, complete in every service and department, and it would therefore seem expedient, as a special case, to allow this railway organization to be reorganized on an approved establishment into a construction and operating company, and to allow it to continue working under the Canadian Corps direction at present. This would be encouraging for the national aspirations of Canada towards the formation of a self-contained military force." End quote. GHQ relented, and it and the War Office sanctioned 2 new tramway companies for the Canadian Corps in November of 1917. For the Passchendaele campaign in October-November 1917, 100 men from the Pioneer Company went to Passchendaele to build 4 miles of new lines. The primary objective of this 4,100-yard tramline extension was to deliver plank for forward road construction. During the construction of this line, over 40 sections of track were relayed due to shell fire, for an extra 2,113 yards being laid. While the Corps promoted tramways, Major Goldie noted that great difficulty has been experienced in getting the divisions to use the tram line to organize a system of operation. End quote. The month of November was also momentous for the Canadian Tramways. It came into being on the 14th of November. It was divided into 2 companies. Number 1 company to be known as the Canadian Corps Tramway Operating Company, and number 2 company to be known as the Canadian Corps Tramway Construction Company. The strength would be 3 officers and 267 other ranks per company. Despite the different nomenclature, the units were identical in manpower, structure, and function. By early 1918, delivery of supplies by the forward railways were characterized into 4 zones, A through D, as shown in the top diagram. The broad gauge railhead was about 8 miles or 14,000 yards from the trenches. Zone A used a 20-pound track per foot and steam locomotive propulsion with a ballasted track and provided ammunition to 90% of the heavy batteries to about 10,000 yards or 7 miles from the trenches. Zone A connected from the railhead with Zone B and offered a complementary service for the lorries hauling heavy ammunition and horse transport hauling supplies. Zone B used petrol locomotives on the 20-pound per foot track that was not always fully ballasted. In case of advance, Zone B became Zone A once necessary work was done to improve it, and the Assistant Director of Light Railways at Army level took it over. Zone B provided the remaining 10% of the siege batteries with their ammunition. Zone C might have some 20-pound track, but it was usually of French or German origin and unballasted. This zone provided brigade dumps with ammunition and supplies and engineer field company dumps. This zone complemented what was normally exclusively the horse transport area. Where Zone C meets D was called the power head, or the limits that the petrol-powered tractors could go forward. Zone D used prefabricated 9-pound per foot track in the shell hole pitted area cut with trenches. Zone D was usually built by the divisional pioneers under the supervision of the tramway company to ensure the alignment, grades, drainage would meet plans in case of advance. Because of direct observation by the Germans, these lines are built and operated only at night. This zone used push cars. Zone D would get taken over by the tramway company for petrol locomotive in an advance. At Passchendaele, it was found useful to have a push car line advance at the same time beside the new forward plank road to permit the movement of planks forwards. However, there could be up to 30 breaks in 2 miles in one night to fix. On February 22nd, 1918, the tramway companies changed names once again to the First and Second Tramway Company Canadian Engineers. This was to prevent confusion with number 13 Canadian Light Railway Operating Company and the number 2 Canadian Construction Company already serving in France. A month later, March 4th, 1918, the manpower establishment changed to what the Canadian Corps argued should have been the proper size for a light railway unit operating at the Corps level because of the greater construction effort. The Canadian Corps argued there should be 383 instead of 273 personnel in a British light railway company. This higher number of soldiers was what the Canadian Corps wanted back in August of 1917, but rather than quibble on the size, the Corps had compromised to receive authority for permanent units. Once they established these units, they then took the next logical step of beefing them up to give it the extra construction manpower the Canadians believed were needed for mobile warfare. In fact, the BEF adopted the Canadian structure, although GHQ called the British companies four-ways companies. While the BEF wanted a four-ways company per corps, only about 1/3 of British corps received one by the end of the war, largely due to manning shortages. This change is important because the Canadian Corps believed the larger organization would permit tramway companies to be able to leapfrog forward in mobile operations with the extra construction sections. But changes not only came in structure and organization, but also roles for the tramways. The Canadian Corps also developed new ideas to weaponize the tramways. During the winter of 1918, the BEF prepared for an expected onslaught by the Germans by building lateral broad gauge railways connecting each of the 5 British armies. GHQ also decided they needed lateral narrow gauge network to allow for the rapid lateral reinforcement movement of guns, brigades, and divisions. The BEF also realized the Germans would likely employ captured British tanks, and there were rumblings of German domestic tanks. While the Royal Artillery knew that its 18-pounders would be effective against their own tanks, questions remained what to do if the tanks broke through and achieved a deep penetration past the forward 18-pounder gun line. So this was a two-part problem. The first was developing and practicing rapid techniques for moving 18-pounders. The second was for the artillery practicing direct fire techniques against moving targets. For the first problem, the Second Tramway Company reported carrying out movement drills of 18-pounders and reported on the 8th of February 1918 that they had loaded and moved 4 miles and unloaded an 18-pounder in 1 hour and 10 minutes. A second practice moved another 18-pounder 4¼ miles in 2 hours. Practices continued through March and April. In May 1918, First Tramway Company shared its knowledge when it demonstrated and trained the 20th Division Artillery in light railway rapid movement. As for the second part, the Canadian Corps put on a demonstration to show that 18-pounders could be rapidly moved to an area of tank penetration, unload the guns, engage the tanks, and reload onto the narrow gauge railway cars to go on to the next assignment. On Sunday, March 10th, south of Suchez in the Zouave Valley, the Canadian Corps ran a direct fire 18-pounder range with a moving plywood target of a 3/4 size tank moving at 3 to 5 miles per hour. A gun crew engaged the target 1,000 yards away. Then crews from the 1st and 13th Corps also conducted a shoot. To mimic real-life conditions, the moving targets moved on a 45-degree angle as shown in this map on the right. Further, Second Tramway Company converted a 60-centimeter flat car into a boxcar ammunition wagon fitted with pigeonholes to take 192 rounds of 18-pounder ammunition, and is found very useful as the ammunition can be safely carried without its boxes. Later, in April and May, further tests were run with rapid loading and unloading of the larger 6- and 8-inch guns based on the 60-centimeter gun trucks. On April 26th, the First Tramway recorded, quote, "At the request of Brigadier General W.B. King, commanding the 4th Canadian Division, one of the 8-inch gun carriages was fitted up, and under the supervision of Lieutenant Collison, shown on the right, of this company, the trials were made on the Zouave line, and they were very successful, the gun being fired with practically no recoil. It is proposed to fire 18-pounder guns at night from forward positions on the Corps tramways." A month later, on May 21st, 1918, quote, "A demonstration was given of the use of the tramways for 18-pounder roving guns at the Zouave Valley Gun Spur in the presence of Lieutenant General Sir Ivor Manx, commanding 18 Corps, and also the GOC of the First Army and the CE Canadian Corps and his staff. The International, a converted 18-inch howitzer car, was first tried out as a gun platform, the gun being fired from a position on the car, and afterwards the Imperial Limited was tried. This latter consisted of a pair of 2 small flat cars on which the gun was loaded for traveling, and unloading was done in 20 seconds and the guns reloaded on the train in about 35 seconds. We have these images on this slide to thank from this May event. The second tactical weaponization of the Canadian Tramways was the use of its locomotives and cars to transport gas cylinders to lines close to the front under the command of the Special Royal Engineer Gas Companies. In May 1918, a novel plan evolved to use pushcar tramways to act as a point of release of what was called a gas beam attack. The tramway companies built pushcar spurs at night from the tramway main lines and camouflaged during the day to avoid detection. On the night of the attack, the tractors delivered the train cars to the spurs. The rubber bumpered train cars were uncoupled from the tractor and pushed by infantry to the end of the spur where gas was released when the wind was right. This was no small effort. Over 400 infantry were needed. Attacks happened on May 23rd, 24th, June 8th and 9th, July 12th, 13th, July 18th and 19th, and July 21st and 22nd. 2 such attacks are shown with these maps indicating the gas dispersal. On July 14th, the tramways were notified the Canadian Corps would be going back into the line after being in strategic reserve in the Arras sector, but the British still wanted the Canadians to service Lens and Vimy as well as Arras. To do this, the first tramway moved south to Arras to operate 26 miles of tractor lines and 4.1 miles of push lines. The second tramway company took on an additional 500 personnel from the labor companies for track maintenance and 30 new lorry drivers to operate the locomotives. Effectively, the Canadian Tramways had now become an Army-level asset of 1,000 men and 3.5 company-sized equivalents, while working for 2 British Corps and the Canadian Corps. When the Corps moved to Amiens in August, initially the field engineers and the Canadian railway troops constructed the light railways, not the tram companies. First Tramway moved to Amiens on August 11th to construct and operate post-battle gains along the Amiens-Roy Highway to the southeast, as shown on the map. The 13th Canadian Light Railways Operating Company, previously not working with the Canadian Corps, came under its control on the 12th of August. In this week, the 9th to the 19th of August, the combined effort of these 4 units had reconstructed 13 miles of German lines, salvaged and laid 3 miles of German steel, and laid 6 miles of new steel. After Amiens, the Canadian Corps then switched back to the Arras front on the 23rd of August, with second tramways arriving on the 26th of August. They, with the Canadian railway troops assisting again, repaired 4 lines of 18 miles and had ammunition flowing by the 31st of August. First tramways moved to Arras from Amiens on the 3rd of September. Backing up slightly time-wise on construction policy, in June, GHQ had issued a directive that GHQ had to approve all new lines, including gun spurs. Currie's worst fears of over-centralization had come true. On August 12th, and the last day of the Amiens offensive, GHQ issued a revised instructions that relented on its control. Now they would only need to approve lines behind 10 miles and further behind the railway, the trenches connecting to the railhead, as well as main tracks in the forward area. Further, armies could now approve forward gun spurs, secondary and branch lines to the limit of the track that they were authorized. This would appear to mean greater flexibility and a speeding up of the decision-making in mobile operations. But then GHQ seemingly restricted this by emphasizing broad gauge construction on the 27th of August as GHQ's main priority, with only giving permission on a rare occasion for rehabilitating German narrow gauge lines. But it would appear the Canadian Corps took a liberal interpretation of this rare exception clause based on the largest amount of construction in the war that fall. By September 1st, GHQ reasserted control over all light railway construction. This was surely a confusing summer for all concerned, as it went back and forth between GHQ, Army, and what corps could do. To assist tramways reaching their destinations on the 30th of September, GHQ authorized armies to have track maintenance teams accompany each train to repair brakes. This essentially added a track repair function to the British four-way companies. The Canadian Corps opposed this because it believed its men would then slack off, knowing that the operating trains would do all the repairs, and also the trains would get backed up if they waited for the lead train to repair, instead of the standing patrols from the tramway company doing the repair work. In less than 48 hours, due to Canadian reply, GHQ backed off and made the four ways operating companies back into operating only companies with no manpower for construction or maintenance. From September 28th, now began the practice of leapfrogging tramway companies, and the Canadian Corps moved towards Mons with the construction company of one tramway company always reinforcing the other in the lead, and the traffic section going to the one in the rear. In a sense, a return to the initial naming of the tramways from November 1917, where one was traffic and the other was construction. For the Battle of Cambrai, the plan for the Battle of Cambrai was, quote, the Army commander has agreed to the following. In view of the tactical situation and the probability of a rapid advance by this army, it is essential that supplies should be carried as far forward as possible by some other means than road transport, quote. So the Canadian engineer instructions on the 29th of October elaborated. The field engineer tramways will continue to push on the tramways to Valenciennes and toward Mons along the routes to be determined by reconnaissance and by using old formations and rail as far as possible. Particular care will be taken to keep off any formation likely to be required by broad gauge and to avoid any action which will interfere in any way with the development of broad gauge program. To understand the construction technique of tramways, it's useful to quote Lieutenant Zammers on the bottom right of the first tramway company, who was attached to the Royal Engineers School in England. Quote, every yard must be thoroughly drained. Ballast is the whole secret of successful railroading. 6 to 8 inches is needed immediately after laying track. Red slag from mines is very satisfactory. Work is divided into surveying, grading, track laying, ballasting, and maintenance. We must remember that on Army railroads, we are up against the extraordinary condition that the maximum amount of traffic comes over the road immediately after it is constructed and while the roadbed is still, quote, green, unquote. And by the time the road has reached the final settlement, the track will no longer be used, so that the maintenance conditions are continually at the worst while the traffic is heaviest. And we always have the state of affairs, so that we are at a great disadvantage when comparing our maintenance charges with those of the general standard railway, end quote. As the Army advanced, 9-pound track would be replaced by 16 or 20-pound track capable of carrying the heavier 9-ton capacity narrow gauge cars and the heavier petrol-electric 40 horsepower locomotives and even steam. As the top picture, left picture indicates, this was an all-manual affair with only plows and scrapers for excavation and tip carts for ballast. There was no steam shovels or bulldozers. During February 1918, the 5th Canadian Railway Troops, not the tramways, spent a week experimenting with 3 different track laying techniques for laying track the fastest. This required an adaptation of the broad gauge rail laying crosspiece you can see the first 2 men holding. Note the survey strings and the lack of ditching or much surface preparation. This would be a good indication of rapid movement faced in the fall. After these experiments, Canadian Railway troops were posted to the 4-way school at Savy to teach the remainder of the British Army in this rapid laying technique. And once again, we have some math. As these statistics show, the tramway company had periods of intensive road building usually in the 6 to 8 weeks prior to the battle and the month after the battle, extending the lines forward. At the Somme, they built tram lanes along the previous German tram line right-of-ways. Winters tended to be a period of rest. As circled here, there was no construction in December 1917 and January 19 because of a shortage of narrow gauge railway. In February-March 1918, construction was for 2 lateral connections between the Corps and the armies, as mentioned previously. And during the last 100 days, note the reconstruction effort putting German narrow gauge lines back into service, with new construction typically being sidings, gun spurs, or sections connecting the old trench sections of the front. Also note on the right the number of breaks from shell fire that had to be repaired with March 1917 during the preparation for Vimy, when the German counterfire was intense, and also take a look at the number of breaks in June and July as the Germans tried to disrupt the British preparations for their 1918 offensive. More numbers. During the last 100 days, the Q side of the Army made forecasts of what was needed to be carried based on priorities and cars available, with major categories being heavy ammunition, which required shorter delivery hauls, field ammunition, Royal Engineer stores, supplies, rations, ballast stone, and later passengers. Statistics included both raw tonnages moved, but how many miles, which produced something called a ton-mile statistic. They also tracked the number of trucks and loads required and the average load per truck. Statistics for the intensity of the use of locomotives also indicated their moving time and miles and time spent waiting. Between January and September 1917, the average tonnage conveyed weekly on the light railways operated by the British and Dominion forces expanded from barely 10,000 tons to more than 200,000 tons. This was as locomotives and railway cars became more available in the September 1917. Note the peak months were April and May of 1918. Almost as high was October 1918, when the Canadian Corps used light railway extensively from Cambrai to Valenciennes. There are two discussions amongst historians regarding Canadian Corps light railways. One involves W.J.K. Davies' 1967 citation of statistics from January 1918 that indicated Canadians were twice as efficient as the next comparable British One Corps. He argued Canadians were more efficient, but actually Canadians were more efficient because they had a dedicated tramway companies and doctrine and practice for using trams that no other British Corps was able to replicate because of the limitations in place from GHQ. In essence, the Canadians were more efficient because GHQ gave them an exception, perhaps because of the constant pushback from Currie and a series of successes through 1917-1918. Canadian records indicate that for some months in 1918, that some British Corps actually were more efficient in terms of tons per car because the support went to those corps that were in action compared to the Canadian Corps, which was out of action. Thus, efficiency is relevant to a unit, time, and event. The other debate amongst railway and logistics historians is how much of the cargo hauled by the light railways was needed for their own construction and maintenance. As this table shows, in general, only 5% of the cargo carried was tramway specific for its own building and maintenance. At Vimy, much reuse was made of German track and captured German engineering material, and very little ballast was laid in April-May 1917. Note that railway supplies never exceeded 10% in September-October 1918 during the periods of heavy network expansion between Arras and Mons. Gathering traffic statistics was a change Sir Eric Geddes introduced in late 1916 when transportation was reorganized at GHQ. The weekly traffic chart on the right gives a visual indication of the importance of the tramways. Beginning in November 1917, when enough light railway cars and locomotives had finally arrived in France from the 1916 orders to industry, passenger movements became possible for both unit reliefs and for trips to the baths. Note the average number of passengers carried in March and April during the spring offensives as divisions were rapidly moved around the Canadian tramway network. This was a rapid romp through 2.5 years involving two specialized units. I gave a brief overview of the tactical considerations as well as discussing operational and even strategic debates at the Canadian Corps, Army, and GHQ level. These debates constantly evolved about who should construct and manage traffic movements in a time when the Army was not adequately organized for rapid expansion. Factors in the constant changes included shortages in manpower, track, locomotives, train cars, and even basics such as spikes, timber, and switches. The problem persisted throughout the war. Because the Canadian Corps advocated for and received permission to have its own tramway companies, this meant the Canadian Corps was both far more mobile and could build up resources far quicker prior to battle, which reduced the load on the horse transport and lorry traffic as the supply lines extended across the trench-devastated zone. These two tramway companies helped give the Canadian Corps the pocket army status that many historians argue they believe it deserves in terms of its ability to work at the operational level of war. Thank you.
Amazing. Bradley, thank you so very much. I've got a question from Bill Twist, who asked me to ask on his behalf. Firstly, he says, Bradley, thank you. Great and detailed study and good luck with the doctorate. My question, where is the stuff to build this network? Raw materials like the railway lines, the planks, the ballast, and the sleepers coming from? Via the British or else sourced locally or even summoned from Canada?
This was a truly a global effort. Initial locomotives were borrowed from British mining, primary mining enterprises. Orders were placed in Great Britain and the United States. Canada did not build any petrol locomotives. I don't think they built much in the way of light railway locomotives. They built some big ones for the broad gauge. Um, the timber, the timber often for the Canadian Corps came from either the Canadian Forestry Corps, cutting in France or in Scotland, or the Canadian Corps itself had a Army Troops Company with a sawmill and would cut timber as well. The train cars typically came from British construction, although everybody liked the German rail cars because they were stronger, more durable, and could carry more. The British, the Canadians, especially after Vimy Ridge and Amiens through the fall of 1918, made extensive use of captured engineered material from the Germans. And therefore, they only needed a little bit of material from their own supplies. But that being said, the British had over 700 miles of light railway track in operation. And it was getting into too much detail, but they had to kind of cap that at 700, and then they kept an extra 10% of material for rapid expansion for whatever corps was attacking. I hope that answers your question, Bill.
Thank you. And we're just joined now by David Fuller, and David's going to ask his question in person. Evening, David.
Uh, yeah, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yes.
perfect.
Yeah, Bradley, good to see you. And as I mentioned to you before, you're doing everything I was hoping to do, but you're doing it so well. I'm just thrilled to hear this presentation. I've been reading about the officer training programs that were implemented during the war. British staff officers training Canadians. With the Canadians being so expert at this system, was there any of that in the reverse? Were British officers coming in to learn how things were done and being sent back, or how did the command and control part of this operation work between the two armies?
Um,
Uh-oh.
it's like where to begin. The Canadians had their own Canadian Engineer School at Seaforth. And part of their curriculum in 1918 included light railways. The British themselves set up two different schools in France, one in late summer of 1917, and the other was in I think February, March of 1918 for the four ways. And that was staffed almost exclusively by the British, although some Canadian officers found their way in as attachment. When looking at the nominal roles for the tramway companies and so on, there was never any British attached into the Canadian Corps. And I think that part of that was because Canada had built the CPR in the 1880s. The intercolonial expanded, and then Canada's third national transcontinental was actually underway in 1915 when the war and bankruptcy helped bring it to a halt. So that is why when the Canadians offered railway troops and railway officers in 1916, when the British requested more broad gauge railway troops, the Canadians actually sent 13,000 railway workers to France. So this was one of the times I would say that Canadians had a far more influential role to play at a sense at the theater level. And this was one of the very few areas that they did that. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, sorry, that's fantastic. This is a whole area I'm looking at. The every time Andy Robertshaw comes to speak to our branch, and we bombard him with Vimy stuff, he says, "Ah, you know, that was only part of the Battle of Arras," and he's always trying to balance the the spotlight on who did what and how good the Canadians were or weren't. And I know that's an ongoing story, and this is part of the reason I was asking the question. But yeah. Fantastic stuff, Brad. I can't wait to hear more about your dissertation when it's done.
Thanks. And David, I'm glad you brought up Vimy. It's a little pet peeve of mine, but the Canadians spent a long time in the Vimy sector. And the First and Tramway Company, in a sense, are, as I pointed out in July of 1918, they're providing tramways to 3/4 or practically 3/4 of an army. So this is a case of also the light railways were punching above our weight.
I've got a question from Gordon Holmes, and Gordon says, how many men were required to maintain these lines, and was this number calculated into an efficiency graph?
How many men? Yes. For the Canadians, there are two tramway companies. They had what we called the traffic section, a headquarters section with some motor lorries and a survey team and the signalers. And then there was 4 construction sections. So out of the 370, over 250 of them, I think, were actually construction role. So the majority of them were organic to the company to be able to provide the ongoing maintenance. And then anywhere between 1 and 3 sections might be built doing new building. There was a comment in what I read, though, that a tramway company should never be more responsible than for one main line servicing one division. If it was spread over support of 2 divisions, then work didn't progress as nicely. But I do want to point out, though, that the Canadian Tramway Company did need help in the fall of 1918 during the last 100 days. Everybody was moving so quickly and so broadly across the front that the Canadian railway troops ended up getting employed in helping to do construction. And even the Canadian field engineer battalions, and Canada had battalions, not companies, in the last year of the war. They were often allocating 1 or 2 of their 4 companies to assist in light railway work.
Mark Smith has asked me to raise this comment and question on his behalf. The Moseley Railway Trust, and I think that's Apedale Light Railway in Staffordshire, UK, has constructed an accurate replica of the wagons to carry the 18-pound guns as part of its replica trench display and depiction of light railways and tramways. I'm amazed that the drilled troops could unload an 18-pound gun for firing in 20 seconds and reload it in, was it 36 seconds? When we tried a few times in 2018, it took several minutes and many volunteers in uniforms to do this, a bit like experimental archaeology. I wondered if the same drill and procedure was standardized and used by all companies to unload and reload the guns. To move guns around like this so rapidly on light rail must have been transformative compared to haulage by road.
Yeah, yes, I would agree. And unfortunately, there are, I've looked through over 1,000 boxes in our national archives, and I've never found the level of detail of how do you load a flatbed train car. But I can well imagine the 18-pounder field artillery. They could drill continuously for occupying a position and leaving a position. They do that to this day. And being able to take a gun apart and move it over an obstacle and put it back together. And there was even competitions in 1917 and 1918 amongst the various functions of the Canadian Corps. So it would not surprise me that they took it upon themselves as a personal challenge who could do it the fastest.
Right. Thank you. Brilliant. And we are just about to be joined by John Azar, who has a question to ask you directly himself. Evening, John.
Good evening, or good afternoon here. The last picture you had showed the car with some camouflage, but most of the time they're operating out in the open, and they're during construction relatively slow moving. So I'm wondering what casualty rates were like. The light rail.
I'm glad you asked that, John, because my presentation would have gone about another 20 minutes. Actually, let's see. That's evacuation of casualty. There's the casualty statistics for the tramways. 757 total. Most of those were evacuated sick. Believe it or not, only 34 killed, 1 killed by gas, and 5 killed by accidents. It was actually the number of times a locomotive actually got, I don't think I read anywhere where a locomotive actually got hit by a shell. More than likely what happened is the track got hit and then it ran into the hole. And I have read across reports of some of these injuries would have been caught that exact thing. There's also dangerous cargoes, and I have one locomotive disabled when a hand grenade, a Mills bomb, started sizzling, and the guy threw it off, but it still damaged the locomotive. More than likely, you were to have injured by collisions at night, or collisions with trucks, guns, or Model T Fords, or people walking on the track and then getting hit by a locomotive. These locomotives typically only did about 3 or 4 miles per hour.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you very much. A couple of other questions. So Brian Matthews has just asked, what prompted your interest in this area?
Very good philosophical question. In 2019, I had 2 children, one in middle school and one in high school. They re-engaged me with military history after being away from it for 5 years. I had taught at Canada's Military College, and that program I was teaching it ended. And so I wanted to do a doctorate because I already had some masters, and I didn't want to write another regimental history of the First World War. And I went looking around, and I do data statistics for a day job at my university. So I went taking a look at what all the various functions were in the Canadian Corps and correlated that with what had been published, and found almost zero published on the combination of the engineers and the Army Service Corps. And in this case, the tramways actually fall underneath the engineer function as opposed to the Army Service Corps. So that's when I knew I had something. And I've been working at it for about 5 years now.
Wow, amazing. Just a couple of final questions here firstly from Kit Reed. Why was the gauge 24 inches or 60 centimeters chosen? Also, are there any books about the extent of the narrow gauge tramway?
Yes. Why was that gauge chosen? That goes back to 1860s, 1870s, when it became standardized in Europe between the French and the Germans for use in kind of like commercial mining or moving supplies around industrial concerns. Decauville is the name, and it kind of became the standard for being able to buy prefabricated sections of track. I think that answers the first question. The second question was, can you remind me again, Luke?
Yes, of course. And the second question was around about books that you recommend. Are there any books about the extent of the narrow gauge tramway?
Yes, there is. The W.J.K. Davies 1967 Light Railways on the Western Front, out of print, hard to get. I think my copy cost me about 100 Canadian. It's a good, he did a pretty good job for 1967. There are two newer books out by a husband and wife team named Feathers something or other, and it's basically light gauge on the Arras front and light gauge on the Somme front, and they kind of take the view of before the war, during the war, and after the war examination of the French and British railway network. Canadian stuff is in there as well. You can find those on Amazon or probably your local bookseller. But I can provide that information in a post-webinar part of my presentation.
Great, fantastic. Ross McLaughlin asks, how did the drivers navigate the various branches? By maps, or were there signs at the points?
How did they navigate? By maps or?
By signs at the points. Signs
at the points? No, they didn't have maps. It would be, there wasn't, I have a video that we didn't have time to show. From that video, there was no signs even at the points. For the most part, the network that they're operating on, it's only shuttles of a couple miles. So they would actually know it quite well. In fact, they might have even walked it several times to go between where they lived and where they picked up their locomotive. So no, there wasn't usually much in the way of signage.
Great, fantastic. So just finally, a couple of points for info. David Fuller, who we heard from earlier, says you can also read about the various units in Canadian Marine and Railway World, which is available online.
It's a contemporary journal from the time period, yes.
Brilliant. And also, finally, from Paul Cobb, who says, for info, narrow gauge in the hour sector before, during and after the First World War, Allied Railways of the Western Front by Martin and Jane Fairbrother, which is, I think, the book that you were alluding to.
Yes.
Great. So really that brings us to the end of our session for this evening. So it just leaves me to say, Bradley, thank you so very much for providing a fascinating talk about what I think is quite a little known, but phenomenally interesting area of the First World War. So, thank you very much. And thank you very much to everybody in the audience for joining us this evening. We hope we'll see you again before too long.
Mademoiselle from Armentières.